In this segment, we will dive into the report, Chilling Prospects Tracking Sustainable Cooling for All 2021. Now, just to remind everyone, and if you are tuning into the broadcast for the first time only now, we encourage you to follow along and share your thoughts online and on social media using the hashtag #ThisIsCool. And of course, you can also join in the conversation by asking questions on the YouTube chat channel. Now, our next guest is Brian Dean. He is the head of energy efficiency and cooling in Sustainable for All's Vienna office. Brian, as his designation suggests, he focuses on creating and executing the overall strategy for SE4All's engagement in the space of energy efficiency and cooling. Now, Brian will be sharing the key findings from the report. Brian?
Thank you, Finn. And thank you, Francesco and Damilola, for opening the event, and to the moderators and participants that will be joining us today to discuss access to cooling. And a big thanks to those in the background on the SE4All team, particularly the cooling and communications team, who have brought new innovations this year and to really make the data, as Damilola mentioned, but the report and presentation of information more useful and accessible. So with that, let me get right into the slides. And here we are, launching the report, and thanks to our funders, of course, for helping us get through to this point. So the report has 4 main chapters. I'll focus my presentation on the highlights from the first 2 chapters, with global tracking of access to cooling, both at the national and subnational level. And the panel that follows will be able to discuss these findings and share their global experiences. While the conversation session on cooling and COVID later in the agenda today will build on the findings of the 3rd chapter and the big stories of the day on the inequalities being exacerbated by the lack of access to cooling. And of course, on a more positive note, the solutions and profile session will share solutions identified in the 4th chapter, where we're seeing solutions that are really delivering impact. And hopefully this will really help us globally to take the next step. And on the topic of solutions, as we heard, cooling is not a luxury, but globally we do have cool solutions that can provide this fundamental need of cooling cost effectively. Beyond our release of Chilling Prospects today, in the coming month, we will also be releasing an easy-to-use online tool that will help you identify sustainable cooling solutions in coordination with our #ThisIsCool campaign that Finn mentioned earlier. So please do look out for that as well. So in chapter 1, the biggest story, as highlighted earlier by Damilola as well, is that due to the pandemic, and for the first time, we have a significant increase in the number of people at high and medium risk. For high risk, this includes the rural poor and urban poor, who lack access to energy and often live on less than $2.50 a day. They have cooling needs, as you saw in the video, that include human comfort and safety during a heat wave, receiving food and nutrition from agriculture that need cooling to stay fresh, and as many of you have heard a lot about in this last year, for healthcare and keeping vaccines safe and effective, not just for COVID vaccines, but also for the main routine vaccinations that are needed across the globe. The population at medium risk, those are people that have access to energy, but do still live on less than $10 per day and are really at risk of using the least efficient refrigerators and air conditioners, possibly even older, unmaintained, used technology dumped from another country. So through urbanization and electrification, we've seen a trend for fewer rural poor. But this year, we do show a significant increase of 31 million more people in the rural poor. This, coupled with the continued trend of increasing urban poor, results in this 50 million more people at high risk this year due to the pandemic. Now, one aspect of the pandemic is job losses that have thrust 70 million more people into poverty in just these 54 high-impact countries alone, mostly in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, as shown on the left chart. But this is, really something that's affecting us globally. But in these 54 countries, we have 70 million people. In the right chart, we do see that the lower middle income population grew by 164 million. So when you look at the high risk growing by 50 million and this medium risk, lower middle income, growing by 164 million, we see a reversing of a steady trend that we've had over the past 10 years. Further in our global tracking, we review which countries are working to address the risks associated with cooling by developing national cooling action plans. And in Asia, we can see that the two large critical countries, two of the 9 critical access to cooling countries, have already published their national cooling action plans with India and China. While 6 more are in progress, and we know of at least 1 more, Indonesia, that's just at the beginning of the process, and you'll hear more in the panel discussion thanks to efforts through the Cool Coalition and the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program by UN Environment. In Africa and the Middle East, Rwanda was the first in that region to develop a national cooling action plan, while 5 other countries are currently in progress working on the national cooling action plans. In Latin America, we have a lot more activity. Where across Latin America and the Caribbean, we see that Cuba, Panama, and Trinidad and Tobago have published their national cooling action plans, and 11 more are currently in progress. But this map shows progress, but it also shows a lot of gaps, particularly for the 54 high-impact countries to protect vulnerable populations and also to better achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as mentioned in the opening. So one country that is working on a national cooling action plan, as you just saw, but has not been included in our 54 high-impact countries is Mexico. And this year, for the first time, we're using geospatial data to better understand subnational risks. And we include analysis in the report for states in India, Pakistan, and Mexico. For Mexico, it's not a high-impact country for access to cooling, but it does have regions that are facing challenges. Here you see high temperatures and population density for Veracruz and Guerrero. 2 states may be known a little bit more for their tourism than their high population, but they're growing regions of Mexico. And while the average income is not as low as many high-risk populations around the world, some zones do have extreme poverty. And that result, it has people at high risk due to lack of access to cooling in Mexico. And with this type of deeper analytics, we've been able to examine an additional 22 countries where you can see Mexico, Nepal, Ethiopia, and Colombia are 4 countries that have the most population at risk outside of the 54 high-impact countries. While most of the risks are population at medium risk, the blue color, there are still significant numbers of rural and urban poor. When we take those 22 additional countries and that 30 million additional people that are at high risk, 6 million in the rural and 25 million in the urban poor, adding these to the high-risk populations in the 54 high-impact countries, we estimate just over 1.1 billion at high risk. So instead of 1.09 in the 54, we go up to about 1.12 billion of high risk globally across the 76 countries. By using this data, we hope to support creating better national cooling action plans and policies that protect the vulnerable, deliver efficient and climate-friendly solutions, and support our goals on achieving sustainable energy for all. So do check out our website for more data, including 10-year trends and stories from the report as well. So a big thanks to the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program and the Swiss Agency of Development and Cooperation for funding our work and making this possible. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Tin.
Thanks very much, Brian. That was illuminating, but also actually quite concerning seeing, the impacts. I do have a quick follow-up question. I mean, what would you say is the one thing that perhaps countries can do right now and relatively easily to sort of improve access to cooling? What would be the recommendation you give?
Great. Yeah. Well, given the global push to create jobs and repair the damage caused by the pandemic on our economies, the one thing I would say is investing in sustainable cooling solutions. And these can deliver both local and meaningful jobs like painting cool roofs, planting trees to reduce the urban heat island effect, or services like cooling as a service, or even extending the medical cold chains. This is a particularly important year for that, but doing it with efficient and climate-friendly equipment. So most importantly is really these countries enabling those jobs and using the National Cooling Action Plans or heat action plans to really protect the vulnerable populations that we've identified. So I would say it's all about jobs and using access to cooling as a means of bringing those local meaningful jobs.
Great. Thank you for that answer. And also, again, thanks for the presentation, which clearly laid out, the trends in terms of access to cooling, and explaining also how the findings could actually support progress on the SDG, which, as we all know, we need to achieve by 2030. Thanks again, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, then.